Hi, everyone. Thank you for being with us, and welcome to the Community Climate Hub Summer Webinar Series. For those of you joining us for the first time, welcome to the Community Climate Hub Initiative. My name is Emily. I'm the Volunteer Engagement Coordinator here at Climate Reality Project Canada. We train leaders to share the urgency of climate change and the solutions to address it. We're also creating community climate hubs throughout the country that help raise the bar on climate action in Canadian cities, all the while spurring ambition at the provincial and federal levels as well. So today's webinar is the 5th in our summer series, which you can see listed on your screen. And you can sign up for the upcoming webinars at climatehub.ca. These webinars are meant to exchange best practices and tools that you can leverage in your own cities to accelerate the transition to a low carbon economy. So today's webinar features Louise Hénaud-Etier. She's the Scientific Projects Manager at David Suzuki Foundation, and she's also the Vice President of the Société Québécoise de Phytotechnologie and member of the Executive Committee of the Hansik College. She, in her free time, devours scientific literature on the subject of entomophagy and makes it digestible for the general public. She's a former environmental coordinator at Concordia University and worked as a scientific host at Montreal's Botanical Garden, Insectarium, and Biodome. She joined DSF in 2016 and became a reality leader with Climate Reality in 2017 and is a doctor in environmental science. She studies pesticides, agricultural fields, and energetic biomass. And for the past decade, she's been researching organic waste management in Quebec and is a compost specialist. She oversaw the implementation of an urban composting system able to process 100 tons annually. Nowadays, she's studying how insects could eat our waste and feed us as well, sustainably. She's a committed scientific and public speaker and the recipient of numerous awards. So with no further ado, Louise, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Can you see the screen?
Not just yet.
Is that working?
No, still not.
Sorry for the glitch. It was working earlier. How's that?
There we go. Yeah.
And now you can see the slides?
Yep, that's perfect.
Excellent. Good. So, well, thank you very much for welcoming me here today. It's a great pleasure to share with you my passion on the topic of organic waste management. I now work for the David Suzuki Foundation. So for those that are not familiar with the foundation, the foundation's mission is to protect the diversity of nature and our quality of life for now and future generations. So we work on various issues, including climate change, health, ocean and freshwater, biodiversity, and working along with First Nations as well. My expertise, as you've seen, is has a lot to do with organic waste management. So I actually have enjoyed for a long part of my life playing in organic waste. And more recently, I started collaborations with different researchers that are either specialized in sociology, in entomology, so the study of insects, in organic waste management, or in actually animal feeding. So with all of these collaborators from different universities in Quebec, including Université Laval, Sherbrooke, et UQAM, and Reusable Quebec, which is a governmental organization, I was able to pursue some postdoctoral research on these different topics. So the first thing I'd like to mention is actually the economy is growing, and we seem to be living in an infinite planet where we just want the economy to grow forever and ever. And for a very long period of time in Quebec, actually, the economy was growing at the same rate as our waste generation, which was not very much sustainable, let alone on the process of extraction of raw material, but also just in the process of dealing with this waste. But fortunately, since about 2008, 9, there's been a decoupling of waste generation and economy growth. So we're actually dealing better with our waste. Nevertheless, Quebec are still champions at the waste generation with over 700 kilograms of waste per person per year. And this waste is decomposed in different streams. So there's the organic waste, there waste that are recyclable, and all of these should be treated in a different way. Actually, the content of our waste relies very heavily on the organic fraction that's within, and that's very normal because organic waste is pretty much everything that was once alive or that is produced that was produced by a living organism, and we're all organic and we eat organic matter. And so when I say organic, I really mean organic in the chemical sense of being composed of carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, nitrogen. And as you see, the carbon ratio of 45 to 55% of all organic matter is very high. So when I'm entitling near carbon neutral my presentation here, I mean, we cannot abdicate the fact that we're living organisms really composed of carbon, but I'm arguing for the sake of decreasing the net emissions of carbon in our atmosphere, which, as you know, I hope you know, leads to global warming or climate change. So 44% of our municipal organic waste is actually organic. That represents about 4.6 million tons of organic waste per year. And you can add on top of that all the agri-food waste, which is another 1.9 million ton. And we have a very low valorization rate of this waste. So whatever waste exists to what we can treat in a sustainable manner is very low. For the municipal sector, it's in the 20s, the percentage. For the ICI sector, so institution, businesses, industries, is near 30%. The only place where we're actually doing a good job is for the organic waste coming from the agro-feed industry, because it's large quantities of pretty homogeneous waste and it's clean, so it's easier to manage with a 96% recuperation rate. And so these percentages are old. I know there's new numbers that just came out recently, but we're improving slowly, but we're still very far from reaching the objective in the province of Quebec of valorizing, banning landfilling of organic waste by 2020, which is nearly tomorrow. And we had a target to reach 60% of organic waste diversion from landfills by 2015, which we did not reach, unfortunately. So how do we deal with our organic waste right now? We deal with it in a variety of methods, and I'll be going through the very basics of landfilling, incineration, composting, and biomethane ization first, so you understand what we've actually been doing. So if you landfill organic waste, it will decompose in absence of oxygen in the landfill. And in absence of oxygen, instead of having microorganisms that breathe and eat your waste and release carbon dioxide into the air, they actually have no oxygen, so you cannot produce CO2, and you therefore produce methane. And methane is a potent greenhouse gas. So you need to capture the landfill gas that comes out of these landfill and burn it. You can flare it, so at least you transform it, you oxidize it fully and transform it in CO2, which has a lower impact on climate change. Or you can actually recuperate this methane and clean it up and use it as an energy source. But nevertheless, it's totally unsustainable to just put all of your waste in a big hole, because it's mixed with potentially contaminated waste, and you can contaminate your groundwater. So there's several reasons you wouldn't want to landfill, and not, let alone the policy in Quebec that says that we are not to landfill organic waste beyond 2020 in the province. There's also reasons why you wouldn't want to incinerate your waste. It seems like a very easy solution. It reduces the volume of waste, and you only have to deal with the ashes, but then you send out in the atmosphere a lot of particles that can affect breathing and affect the lung capacity of your residents and even shorten their life. And you also generate nitrous oxide, which is 298 times more potent as a greenhouse gas than CO2 is. So for these reasons, landfilling and incineration of waste in general or organic waste is not a privileged method to deal with it. There's also something very serious we need to consider. We have a lot of organic waste in our garbage, and actually, a lot of it is not real waste. It's how can I put it? It's food waste. We shouldn't leave it there. There's stuff that is still edible, or we should have planned better not to waste so much food. If you would put food waste as a nation in the world, it would rank third behind China and the United States in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. So it's pretty serious. We need to handle organic waste in a better manner, not only the real waste, but just the wasting of consuming too much and letting good food go to the garbage. How would nature do it? Actually, nature would deal with organic waste with microorganisms like bacteria, actinomycetes, fungi, and there's several other microorganisms like eukaryotes or insects or worms that would eat this decaying organic matter and the associated microorganisms that are with it. So that's the way nature would do it. There's several ways we can improve our organic waste management, and this would improve the landfill lifespan. So for the ultimate waste we really don't know how to valorize and do something better with, then there'll be more time available to fill our existing landfill. It could decrease greenhouse gas emissions that are associated with waste transportation and landfill gases. It could decrease the leachate that contaminate our groundwater. And more beneficially, we could actually produce good compost, sorry for the typo here, that would improve the quality of our soil for agriculture. So what is composting? Composting is organic waste recycling. Basically put, it's a way that we use microorganisms and microorganisms to produce a humic acid-rich, stable product that is full of nutrients and full of carbon that can help midterm sequestration of carbon in our ground if we use it in agriculture, for instance. So it's a controlled biooxidation process, and we somewhat optimize what nature has been doing for years in terms of dealing with organic waste. And so we can do this domestically. You've all been familiarized with how to use bins or just make up a pile and leave it to mature, and then you use it in your garden, and that's very beneficial. You can also do it on site at the waste generation site at a scale that is larger than a domestic setting. For instance, using bioreactors, which really help to control temperature, rotation, humidity, it controls smell and everything. So these are good ways to deal with your waste on site. And dealing with waste on site is actually very important. I'll come back to it later, because waste transportation is basically transporting something very heavy. The further you go, the more fuel you consume and the greater impact you have on your environment. So to be able to treat your waste locally, you need to address what it contains. And so this is an example of a waste audit I led at Concordia University about a decade ago. And so we were trying to understand what's in our garbage, what are the different categories of waste, and how we could better deal with it. And we found that compostable waste were actually constituting about 60% of the waste that was coming out of the cafeteria, or 24% of the waste that was just general waste from the rest of the university. And we calculated that we were actually generating about 100 tons of organic waste per year. And this organic waste, if it was being sent to the landfill as it was, had a huge environmental impact in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. A lot of CO2 equivalents were produced, over 150 tons per year of CO2 equivalents for 100 tons of organic waste. But there's also acid rain precursors, smog precursors, atmospheric pollutants, and aquatic pollutants that were being emitted because this organic waste was being sent to the landfill. Now, using a mathematical model, we calculated, that was part of my master's, that if we would compost this organic waste on site, we would reduce pretty much all the categories of impacts that we could have. So that's why we decided to find a system that was suitable for composting on site. And this is one of the bioreactors you saw, was one of the solutions that was available back then. Back then, there wasn't a lot of centralized composting facility on the island of Montreal, so sending it out to a composting facility much further away from the city was really not a positive option. But today, there are several composting facilities that exist all around Canada. Large-scale composting plant that can be indoor, where you control better the humidity and the smell, but it's more costly because you need this big infrastructure. You can do it in windrows, and to optimize your process, you can actually use covers that will prevent excess leachate, and you have these specialized equipment like the windrow turners that can help to mix your organic waste so that you really optimize the process, accelerate it, make sure you don't have any anaerobic micro pockets where you would have generation of methane, much like you have in a landfill. If you don't mix your composting sufficiently, you'll have generation of methane, which is a greenhouse gas. Another technology which is rising in Quebec right now is biomethane ization. So simply put, biomethane ization is actually taking your organic waste, and instead of composting it in presence of oxygen and releasing CO2, you methanize it with microorganisms in controlled anaerobic settings. So you are generating methane, but this methane is not leaching to the atmosphere. It's actually being contained and funneled and cleaned, so you can use it as an energy. So this can also be done on site. For instance, in Quebec, there's a couple of cheese factories that use this process with the waste, so the waste milk, and they generate their own energy for their cheese manufacturing operations. And there's municipal systems. So this is an example in Toronto, where for a lot of years there were only flaring the gas that was coming out, but more and more we're recuperating this gas. And for instance, in Saint-Hyacinthe in Quebec, this is the first and the largest biomethane ization plant for municipal infrastructure, and they produce 8 million cubic meters of biogas a year. So they purify it and they can reuse it, for instance, in powering their municipal fleet of vehicles. So this really saves on greenhouse gases if you're replacing some of the gas you have by this more sustainable biomethane that's produced from your waste. But then when you need to take a decision, what type of treatment are you going to do? You need to take into consideration several factors. So that's why using modelization, like I showed you before at Concordia University for 100 tons of organic waste, I use this model that was created by the University of Waterloo, where you consider all your inputs and your outputs and the way you treat your matter. And so you can make a better enlightened decision as to what type of technology is best for the waste you have in the system that you have. There's several types of these systems models that exist, and they allow you to take a better decision. You can also use a life cycle analysis approach like researchers have been doing in Sherbrooke University, where they're trying to compare actually biomethane ization, composting, and landfilling of the organic waste, and taking into account different factors from the whole life cycle. So from the production stream to the utilization to the end of life of your facilities. And what they found is that landfilling has the greatest impact compared to biomethane ization, has somewhat of a strong impact. I don't know if it's statistically different from composting, but definitely you can see that switching away from landfilling to composting or biomethane ization is generally beneficial. And their target region of study was in the eastern townships in Quebec. So if you transport your waste, you have a huge impact. And so you'd want to look for decentralized composting facilities and alternate fuels for transportation. Like I mentioned, using the biogas would do some goods. A couple of years ago, I did a model with several PhD students from Université du Québec à Montréal, and we were looking into a dynamic model of organic waste generation. So instead of being a static model where you enter just raw data on different types of technologies, we actually had decision modules in our model, and we were trying to predict over time what's going to happen with organic waste generation in Quebec, given that we have a policy that favors switching away from landfilling and going more into composting and biomethane ization. So using this model, what we saw is that with the governmental subsidies on composting and biomethane ization and using different value schemes, we would over time see a decrease in landfilling, a decrease in incineration, and then an increase in biomethane ization or composting in windrows or composting in indoor plants, like the pictures I showed you a little bit earlier. So this seems favorable, seeing that the policy we have in Quebec may favor dropping landfilling over time and favor other alternative technologies. Now, what happened is that the government has prioritization of organic waste management in general. We don't want to eliminate waste. The first thing we want to do is actually to reduce at the source, like stop wasting food and give it away to food banks. But then I realized that doing this model and being in organic waste management for 10 years, I had actually never seen the potential benefits of using insects to deal with organic waste. And I thought that was something that needed to be more researched. So for instance, if you use insects, you're actually somewhat reusing your waste because you're feeding your insects, which are animal, with your organic waste. And it's a little bit better than just composting or biomethane ization, where you produce compost, you produce energy, but you're not actually feeding a living organism. And insects are actually a solution that is put forward by the FAO at a global scale, because we'll be 9 billion humans on the planet by 2050. We need to double our food production. And animal farming for animal protein has a huge environmental impact. So on a global scale, the FAO has numbers of 18% of our greenhouse gases are produced by animals, animal farming. And this is more than the transportation sectors combined. And actually, insects can help with that respect, because insects have a lower environmental footprint. They require less food, they use less water, and it can really improve the way we produce food. But then you need to know, are you going to eat insects directly in your plate? And not necessarily everybody is ready to do that, but perhaps we can feed insects to the animals we eat, and maybe that would decrease the environmental footprint of our food production. But then what are you going to feed your insects? If you look at the environmental impact of producing a kilogram of protein, whether you look at the global warming potential or at the energy use, you quickly see that using insects such as mealworms, you have much less of an environmental footprint than if you use larger warm-blooded animals like beef. And if you use insects to treat your organic waste, you can actually decrease the environmental impact of other methods of dealing with your organic waste, and at the same time you decrease the environmental impact of producing meat. So insects can decrease 50 to 75% of the organic waste mass if you feed them. They can also decrease potentially harmful bacteria. And how we call this process of taking organic waste and feeding it to insects is actually, depending on the authors, either you can use the term entomophagy, from entoma in Greek, which means insects, or entotechnology, which is a contraction, just a shortened word. So any of these are equivalent to insects to treat organic waste, or waste upcycling with insects, or insect waste bioconversion. So this is the process I'll be discussing for the next few minutes. So what happens is that we have very different types of organic waste. It can be mixed urban and garden waste. And I don't think you want to eat the insects that eat this type of waste, because it can be contaminated, but it's really abundant and it's cheap. Then you have the pre-consumer source separated organic waste, like you would find in a restaurant, for example, in the kitchen of the restaurant. It's abundant. It's not that dirty. If it's the post-consumer share may be more contaminated with bacteria, but the pre-consumer share, so what the scraps that come out of the kitchen, are actually pretty clean. You also have commercial waste, which are interesting. However, a lot of them are wrapped up, so it involves some steps to de-wrap these waste and use them. There's urban agriculture waste that urban agriculture is on the rise. If you produce food locally, you can treat your organic waste locally, and using high quality organic waste from urban agriculture to feed your insects, you could actually very much decrease your environmental footprint. So using the agriculture rejected food, so the ugly, like the ugly red bell pepper you see here that are not being sold in the market because they're ugly, those could be fed to humans first, but they also could be fed to insects. Industrial waste, as I said before, are high quality, very high homogeneous. The problem with them is that they're already pretty well valorized. They're oftentimes directly fed to animals we eat. And so they're not considered a waste. They actually are becoming costly. So it's a resource you need to pay for to get your hands on. Then there's various sorts of sludges or excreta from animal waste that might be contaminated. So I don't know if you want to feed your insects with these type of waste and then eat them directly. You need an additional step in the process to do so. So the entomophagy sector would look something like taking organic waste from different streams, using different types of insects, and then transforming your insects into products for human food, or then transforming it via animal and farming animals that are eating these insects, or even feeding these insects to our pets. And this would complement, not necessarily replace, but complement the composting, biomethane ization, or like landfilling infrastructure that is available to treat our waste. If you want to do this, you sort of need to do a mix and match between the type of waste that you have with the type of insects that you have. So there's insects that prefer nectars or pollen. There's insects that exist that are herbivores, they need live plants. There's insects that exist that are carnivores, detritivores, scavengers, coprophagous. So they eat garbage, they eat detritus, they eat dead meat, or they eat feces. And this is their natural specializations. In life, there's insects that can do pretty much everything. So you just need to you do mix and match. What type of insects are you going to use with what type of waste? And so the type of insects that have been used so far include domestic fly, and they're very prolific, and they have a high protein content. However, they're considered a nuisance because they can be vectors of diseases. There's cockroaches. Cockroaches is well known that they eat pretty much everything. And in China, they farm them to feed humans. But there's also like issues with our society willing to eat these insects in North America, where maybe we're not there yet. And there's issues. What if they escape the place they're being farmed? This happened in China. It was a sabotage, but it was considered the Great Escape, where millions of escapees actually exited into the cities. You can use crickets, and so the picture you see is actually an open cricket farm, and they use these cardboard crate to allow the crickets to climb around, and on top of these you have trays where you put dry feed. The problem is that crickets don't necessarily eat waste all that much, or they wouldn't eat a lot of wet waste, and could actually make them sick if you expose them to wet waste. So a lot of crickets are being farmed using chicken feed. And so you need to ask yourself, is it sustainable to use chicken feed to feed your crickets? If you're going to feed these crickets to chicken after, maybe you should just feed the chicken feed. But if you are going to eat those crickets yourself, then yes, it is a positive step. But if you are willing to give these crickets to animals, then perhaps you should consider finding a way to give organic waste to your crickets. And to do so, you'd probably need to dry out your waste. There's mealworms that could be used. Mealworms, actually, they live in flour, and there's different species. And what's interesting about these is that they are actually very amenable to industrialization and automation of the farming process. So what you're seeing here is actually they're being sifted away from the meal they were eating. And so one side you have the insect larva, and on the other side you actually have their frass, or their remaining waste, which contains their own feces or the skin they shed off. And this has been shown to be very good fertilizer. So not only does it fertilize the plants, it actually helps the plant fight off diseases and other insects. So those are being farmed more and more. Now, perhaps the most promising insect to deal with organic waste in around the world right now is the black soldier fly. The black soldier fly is actually an insect that has an adult that is a fly, but doesn't bite, and it doesn't cause problems. Like, it's not a disease vector like you would find for the domestic flies I showed you earlier. They grow very rapidly, and they can eat a lot of mixed type of insects. So there's actually in Canada a company called Entera in BC that takes organic waste from the ICI sector to feed it to these larvae. And then once they're grown sufficiently, they have a migratory behavior where they'll climb up a little ladder and end up in a system where you can actually collect them automatically. So it makes them very useful. And the Canadian government has recently authorized the use of these black soldier fly for feeding chicken and for feeding salmonids, so fish in aquaculture. So it's getting real. It's happening in Canada, and there's several projects happening and developing across the country. So to know this a little bit better, I actually interviewed several people that are associated with the industry of farming insects and recuperating waste to feed pets or to feed animals or to feed humans. And so what I'll be presenting next is actually some answers from a survey that was filled by more than 700 respondents last year, and that's part of the master's project of students I was supervising at Sherbrooke University. So Médavi Dussault helped me to gather these results. So in Quebec, most people have already eaten insects. They say it was either accidental or they wanted to taste it. Very few of them have it in their diet. And very few people are actually unaware that food you normally eat may contain fragments of insects, which is something that is regulated. The maximum amount of insect parts that can be in your flour, for instance. Most people see it as a curiosity, and they taste it to know what it tastes like, or they say they do it because it helps to protect the environment. But it's really on an exceptional to annual basis. Very few people say they eat it every week, for instance. But a lot of people have already repeated their experience of biting into an insect or would repeat this experience. Obviously, a lot of people, instead of biting directly into an insect, would prefer eating powdered insects, so added into a recipe in the form of a protein bar, for instance, or pasta or something like that. The respondents to our survey actually said that they would certainly or probably consider feeding their pets with insects. So they might not be ready to do it themselves, but they might recognize that a dog could naturally eat insects in the grass, and they're not disgusted by this. And people will actually be willing to eat animals that were fed insects. And so we're looping back to our system of farming insects to farm animals, and farming these insects by treating our organic waste in a better manner. So people would be willing to eat fish, chicken, pork, and beef that were fed with insects. Very few people said I wouldn't eat any animals because they were fed with insects. There were some vegetarians, obviously, in our respondents. Actually, this is a huge market because we produce 1,000 tons of fish by aquaculture in Quebec, and it's nearly 100,000 tons in Canada. We produce a lot of chicken, a lot of pork, and a lot of beef. So if you substitute their diet or even part of their diet with insects, it represents a huge market. Among the people that answered our survey, there was something interesting. The girls and the boys didn't necessarily answer the same thing. So the male were more likely to have already eaten insects. Male were more likely to eat a whole larva of a fly, which is not something that the industry is really foreseeing as switching people to eating directly fly larvae is not something that we're expecting to see in the near future. Males would be more likely to eat powdered insects in their meal. But then if you ask them, would you be willing to eat an animal that was farmed eating insects, then there's no difference between male and female. And so it really shows you how everybody has a different behavior. Not everybody's willing to trade off their steak for insects, for instance. But we feel that there would be good reception on the customer side to actually feeding our farmed animals with insects that have eaten organic waste. So when we ask do you think it would be okay for us to give waste to these insects that would then be used in animal farming? And it wasn't entirely taboo. There's definitely education to be done, but 26% of the people said it's okay to give farm waste to insects, and 24% said it's okay to give food transformation waste to insects that we're then going to feed to our animals. 80% of our respondents considered entomophagy, so the practice of eating insects, to be on the rise in North America. And then they would see that the government would need to oversee the functioning of this industry. So if you look on the policy sector, actually, there are waste management subsidies for composting and biomethane ization in Quebec. We want more private, we want more municipal composting facilities according to our waste management policy. However, we are not yet subsidizing facilities that are farming insects to treat with our organic waste. And the agricultural ministry would be okay with farming insects, but feeding insects to the livestock is really something that the federal government has oversight on through the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. As I said before, in 2016, they authorized Enterra's black soldier larvae that were fed with institutional, commercial, industrial, organic pre-consumer waste to be fed to chicken. And then the year later, they authorized this for agriculture. And what we need to do is that it took several years for Enterra to actually obtain this authorization, and we need to streamline the process. At the beginning, the CFIA didn't really know what to ask for. Obviously, these insects need to be clean, they need to be exempt of pathogens, they need to be exempt of chemicals that could be harmful, pesticides, for instance, heavy metals. But more and more, we need a proof of concept that goes across all types of waste to insect streams, and not only by individual facilities. So more individual authorization will eventually lead to better accessibility for smaller businesses to launch their operations. In the very end of my presentation, what I'd like to do is actually give you a case study. Let's look at aquaculture, for instance. In Canada, we produce 120,000 tons of fish per year, and this represents a $690 million market. Most of what we produce are salmonids, so the trouts and the salmons, and they're carnivorous, and so they need a high protein diet. Now, the fish feed we give them represents up to 200 metric tons of feed per year in Canada, and much of it comes from fish meal and oil. Now, fish meal, if you take fish from the ocean and you grind them up and you give them to farmed fish, that is not very sustainable. You should actually fish less and like give your farmed fish something else than the fish you could be eating raw, actually. Some other ingredients in fish feed include oils such as soy, and so monocultures like soy culture is very intensive on the land. It's very intensive. It uses a lot of fertilizers, a lot of pesticides, and it's just generally not a very sustainable way. And one of the biggest reasons why animals have such a huge environmental impact in our diet is the way we do monoculture to feed these animals. Now, using animal byproduct is sort of risky. In Europe, they banned it. There's a bio risk, for instance, with the encephalopathie spongiforme bovine. So it's a disease that is carried through prions in the protein. So you don't want to take a dead animal and feed another animal without considering extensive risk. So there's limitation to using carcasses to feed other farm animals. Now, among the alternatives you could be using, there's different types of plants, the algae, krill, zooplankton, and insects are there. And actually, one of the main limits to insects right now is their high cost. So some people say up to $10,000 a ton of insects. And we really need to do something, because it needs to become common in aquaculture to decrease the environmental footprint of aquaculture. Stop fishing all the fish from the ocean to feed the fish that you're growing in aquaculture settings. Now, insects have comparable protein content to other types of food, but obviously you need to do a protein profile to really be able to replace insects into fish feed. Now, some studies say that you could substitute up to 30% of the fish meal with insects. And so if you consider 30% of 200,000 tons of fish meal per year, that represents 60,000 tons of insects per year that could be diverted only in the aquaculture sector of Quebec. And if you consider the conversion ratio of 10%, so you have 10% of conversion from the organic waste mass to the insect mass, that means that we could supply 600,000 tons of organic waste to supply the aquaculture feed market of Canada. And in Quebec, I said before that we have 4.6 million tons of organic waste produced per year, approximately. So 13% of Quebec's organic waste could supply the Canadian aquaculture industry. That makes it very interesting, considering that there's other markets like chickens and pigs, etc. So overall, in the process, you take your organic waste and you produce insects that can be transformed into oils or proteins. And you have residual compost, which can also be used as a fertilizer on land. So we're expecting this to grow. The FAO forecasts that there'll be an increase in we need an increase in 70% of our food production to feed the world by 2050. And they're really seeing that insects are going to be part of this equation. Now, insects are worth a lot of money, up to $200 a ton for harvested and processed black soldier fly larvae, according to some numbers. But then if you transport your organic waste, it's really costly. So the least transport you have, the more your insect farming facility are closer to your waste generation in cities, the more ecologically friendly it is. And with your insects, you can produce proteins and lipids for feed, but you can do a whole other set of things, like producing biodiesel, enzymes for the pharmaceutical industry, chitin for bioplastics and other aspects, fertilizers using the frass. So I said the outer skin of insects and their feces that can be used for farming fruits and vegetables, for instance. In North America right now, there's a coalition that is arising that is trying to coordinate the work of the government, the researchers, the industries that transform insects for food, and the insect farmers. And so there really needs the coordination of a lot of actors to make sure that this process is going to happen and that we're going to have near carbon neutral organic waste management at the scale of the continent, decrease the carbon footprint of our food production, decrease the carbon footprint of our organic waste management, and just make more food for everybody. So this coordinated development is already happening. The research team I'm working with at the Université Laval is working with several different partners in the insects for food or insects for feed sector. And there's projects that are blooming right now in Europe, but there's actors in North America that are working towards transforming organic waste into insects for feed. And it's a very exciting moment to be studying this field right now. In the drivers that we have, there's obviously banning organic waste landfilling in Quebec is a positive context for the emergence of this sector. And there's several academic publications and international reports, like a FAO report that came out a few years ago, that are really backing the rise of entomophagy to treat organic waste around the world. On the limitation side, obviously there's always limitation, but for now, all the individual companies need to dedicate an important amount of their research and funds to apply for novel feed ingredients at the Canadian Food Inspection Agency to make sure that their insects, with their waste, with their process, would be authorized and considered safe to feed other animals. And consumer change appears slow, but it's happening right now, and we see that more and more people were reluctant to eat insects only a few years back. Now more people have tried it, more people want to try it further. So I think it's really going forward, and we will see this transition of insects to treat our organic waste and to feed our farm animals in the near future. And that would have a huge impact on decreasing the environmental footprint of our insects production right now. So I thank everybody that participated in the compilation of these studies and the survey, and all the industry and governmental stakeholder who participated in the interviews, so that I could give you this portrait here today. And thank you very much to Climate Reality for inviting me to do this webinar. And I will now pass it back to Audrey for any questions or further conclusions. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Louise. That was a great presentation. And I know that some of our viewers or participants are probably asking themselves right now, well, what do I do with all of this newly acquired knowledge? And so I hope I can answer this question in about 10 seconds. If you have not joined a community climate hub yet, it is still time to do so. You can join one of the hubs that's already created, or you can start a hub in your community. Go to climatehub.ca for more information and get in touch with us if you have any questions. So in May, we actually launched 6 hubs in 6 different Canadian cities, and their objective is really to accelerate their municipalities' progress along a 5 milestone framework of measuring emissions, setting a reduction target, drafting a plan to meet that target, and then implementing that plan and monitoring the progress. So without any further ado, I'm going to take a few questions. I know a few questions have already been posted, but if you have a question that you'd like to ask Louise, you have a button at the bottom of your screen that says Q&A. Please enter your question there and we'll try and get to it. So I'm going to start with the ones that we received during the presentation. So Louise, someone was asking, at what stage is the City of Montreal or the Province of Quebec at creating carbon neutral waste? And can you still hear me?
Yeah, actually, the City of Montreal is planning still several composting and biomethane ization facility on the island. So the concept is not to export Montreal's waste to other regions, and to treat it the most locally as we can. And so this has been in the plan for several years right now, and some of the plans that could have been existing at the current moment are still being reviewed, because it's not always easy to make the population accept that organic waste needs to be done locally. So there's a lot of not in my backyard syndrome, and so right now all the final plans are not necessarily finalized, and we really need to see those infrastructures come up. However, in the City of Montreal, to my knowledge, there is yet to be any insect facility built to treat organic waste. There are several things that are being planned. Just outside of Montreal, there's Larvae that is trying to use domestic flies to treat cattle manure. And so they've been at it for a couple of years, and they were in the funding process. They have good insect collection. They've been testing them. They've been testing what the quality of the protein they can get from these flies. There's other large players that are around the world trying to partner with local companies to have development in Quebec of large-scale infrastructure. There's a large-scale infrastructure that are being planned also in Ontario right now, and there's the Vancouver area Enterra plant that exists. So insect farming with waste is on the rise. Insect farming for human food is also happening in near Toronto. Canada has one of the largest insect farm in the world. So it is blooming, but we're not exactly there yet. We still need the government to subsidize. Just to be fair, the rise of the entomophagy sector, as they've subsidized the composting and biomethane ization plant in Quebec. But the Quebec government is getting on the good horse, because they've appointed people to look into this at the agricultural ministry and in the environmental ministry. So more and more they're aware of what's happening, and so the expertise is being developed, and it should happen in the next couple of years.
Excellent. Someone's asking a question that I think you're going to find really interesting, because I remember the whole controversy at Concordia University around the reusable mugs versus the disposable cups. They're asking, do you recommend using reusable plates and cutlery in cafeterias or compostable?
That's a very good question. And so it always depends on like regional issues. You if you can want to have a life cycle analysis to answer these questions, because they seem easy at first, but then like the reusable mug issue we were talking about is you need to reuse, I think the numbers were something like 1,000 times your stainless steel mug to have an equivalent impact as using the disposable mugs. And so I would personally argue for washable dishes, just because it consumes less raw material. But then again, it's not an obvious question to be asked. And certainly if you need to choose between disposable, non-valorizable, non-recyclable, non-compostable disposable cutlery or dishes, then yeah, go ahead with the compostable ones. It's much better than to go with styrofoam or something like this. But I know personally I would have a tendency to choose the washable ones if you're eating outside, and it's just more pleasant to eat anyways.
And I guess it also depends on what the reusable option is made of.
Yeah, definitely. If you have a compostable plate that is made with material that is imported from far away, then it might have a huge environmental footprint compared to compostable items that are made more locally. And there's also issues to consider, like compostable plastics, for instance, can be made from potato starch or from cornstarch or something else. And then are you taking away land for agriculture to produce these compostable materials? So that's why we need to be very careful when we do these switches. But what if you eat, what if you use your insects to deal with your organic waste, then you have food produced with this, and then the residual chitin, so the exoskeleton, is used to make bioplastic to make your compostable matter for your cafeteria. That makes it interesting.
Yeah, and just as a side bracket, I'm thinking for those of us who are from Montreal, and I'm sure this sort of service exists elsewhere as well, I'm just not familiar with them. In Montreal, we have Sustainable Concordia that offers dish rental for really peanuts. It's a few dollars. And so it allows you, if you're having an event or something temporary, to have reusable dishes without actually, buying plastic or ceramic dishes. You can just rent them for.
Yeah, and this system has been going on for a decade now. I'm so proud. It was going on when I was environmental coordinator there and it was implemented by people before I arrived. So I'm so happy to see that a decade later, the system is still available, and it's a very good example of reusing the resources instead of wasting.
Yeah. Give me one second. I think something's going on with the microphones. Okay, can you hear me? Okay, can you hear me well?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry about that. So we got another question. It is, okay, how can we ensure that toxins from contaminated garbage doesn't find its way up the food chain from insects to chickens to humans?
That's a very good question, and that's why it's so hard right now to register insects as animal feed, because the Canadian Food Inspection Agency is really checking on that. So first of all, do not use contaminated waste to produce insects to feed yourself. That would be dangerous. However, if you have like leftover peels of fruits and vegetables at home and you want to farm your own crickets and mealworms and give them your own leftover, that the risk is minimized. However, when you start collecting organic waste from kitchens or businesses, you need to be more careful. And even if you have post-consumer waste, like municipal waste, like the whatever you send out on the street for composting and municipal infrastructure, is not exactly clean. It's abundant, but it's not exactly clean. There's some research. There's someone at the University of Guelph that has done some research and showed that using flies, you actually see a reduction in E. coli and salmonella. I've done similar research during my master's using earthworms, where we would see reductions in E. coli level associated with food waste. So insects have some sort of mechanisms to fend off against these pathogens, and there's a reduction in these pathogens that occur if they're present in the waste. If you're talking about pesticides, for instance, during the breakdown process, during composting, a lot of these pesticides will be broken down, and during the breakdown process, in general, not always, but the toxicity of it might be decreased, or at least you're diluting it with a very vast quantity of other non-contaminated waste, so you're decreasing the total concentration of a pesticide. You would find similar thing for heavy metals, but this is a sure thing, and that happens in anything, any type of feed you want to give animals. You need to have it tested. And so is it more dangerous to use good quality and source controlled organic waste, or to use raw grain that have been farmed in the field using pesticide? And we know there's pesticide residue on them, and we know there's heavy metals potentially in them. So it's always a question of risk factor and control and analysis, but at least distancing yourself with another set of individuals. So for instance, insects are very sensitive, obviously, to insecticides. So if the insects die, then you know the food you gave them was not good. So there's one check balance level there. Insects are quite fragile. And then if you feed at farm animals, that's why the CFIA is so careful, because then you're multiplying the potential impact. You're feeding many animals, and these many animals will feed even many more humans. So you have to be careful. But by distancing yourself, not eating those insects directly, you're decreasing the chances that you would be affected in the end. You have to be careful with organic toxics that could bioaccumulate or biomagnify in the food chain, but that's pretty much with everything. You need to be careful with what you eat, and it needs to be controlled by the government, and there needs to be proper laboratory testing of all of these.
Mm-hmm. So we have two more questions, but we're running out of time. I'm just going to ask one that's probably the quickest one. You showed a chart that compared the protein from animal sources versus insect sources, but do you have a chart that also compares protein from insects versus legumes, vegetables, fruits, etc.?
I'm sorry, I do not have a slide like this, and that's a big question as well. Perhaps all switching to eating only vegetable protein would really very much more decrease our environmental footprint. However, not everybody is willing to do that as we speak, and so trying to decrease the environmental footprint of farming animals right now is one of the ways we can act to decrease the footprint. I do not have this with me on my slide. I think I had soy compared to insects compared to other sources of protein. But
for those of us who really, really love their steak, they will still have the option of a cricket steak or something like that. That's fantastic. Excellent. All right. Well, that being said, I'm going to leave it to Emily just to conclude really quickly. Thank you so much, Louise.
Thanks, Audrey.
So thank you so much for being with us. everybody. And thank you, Louise. This was a wonderful webinar, so interesting. We hope you're leaving today with knowledge and inspiration to get active in your community. And we invite you to sign up to join a hub. Please go to climatehub.ca to find one. Our next webinar is on the 29th of August, so it's Tuesday at 5 p.m. Eastern. It'll feature 3 young architects who founded Morphopolis, which is a sustainable architecture competition that's attracted the attention of Quebec's top architects and planners. So you can sign up for that as well on the same site, so climatehub.ca. And also we're going to have a climate leader training soon. So if you'd like to be involved in climate reality and become a climate leader, make sure you go to climaterealityproject.org/training to sign up for for this training session. It's taking place from October 17th to 19th. So thanks again, everybody, and we'll see you next week.